The silence inside the first-class cabin of Flight 827 felt thick enough to touch. It settled over the leather seats like fog, broken only by the low hum of auxiliary systems and the soft, frantic clicking of 47 smartphones, all pointed in the same direction. Every passenger had become a witness. Every lens was recording history. Captain Daniel Morrison stood in the center aisle, his posture rigid, his face twisted into something between anger and disbelief. He was a man who had spent 22 years commanding aircraft, a legacy pilot whose father had flown for Continental, whose grandfather had piloted bombers in World War II. Daniel had the kind of silver-streaked hair that belonged in recruitment posters, the kind of jawline that suggested confidence and control. But right now, his hand trembled as he pointed toward seat 1A. The man sitting there wore a dark gray hoodie. The hood was pulled up slightly, shadowing his face. Noise-canceling headphones rested around his neck. He had broad shoulders, dark skin, and a leather duffel bag that looked like it had survived a decade of travel. He sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes steady. Daniel had just declared loudly, publicly, that this man did not belong in first class, that he was degrading the VIP experience, that he looked suspicious. Daniel thought he was protecting his passengers. He thought he was upholding standards. He didn't know that the man in seat 1A wasn't just any traveler. He was the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, the man who signed Daniel Morrison's pilot license, the man who could ground him with a single phone call. And in less than 5 minutes, Daniel's entire life was about to change, not with a bang, but with a badge. The rain at Chicago O'Hare International Airport came down in heavy, relentless sheets. It hammered against the tarmac, turning the sprawling runways into rivers of reflected light. Inside Terminal 3, the world beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows looked like a blurred watercolor painting, grays and blues bleeding into one another. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing 777-300ER, Captain Daniel Morrison checked his watch for the 4th time in 3 minutes. They were already 45 minutes behind schedule, and every delay felt like a personal insult. Daniel didn't just fly planes. He commanded them. He ran his flight deck with military precision, a habit inherited from his father and drilled into him over 2 decades in the cockpit. To Daniel, the cockpit wasn't just a workplace. It was a throne room. He was the king of the skies, and he expected nothing less than perfection from everyone around him. "Fuel load confirmed, Captain," said the first officer, a young man named Kyle. He was 29 years old, sharp, efficient, and absolutely terrified of Daniel Morrison. "Took them long enough," Daniel muttered, adjusting the gold stripes on his uniform sleeves. "What about the manifest? I saw the VIP list. We've got Senator Hargrove on board and the CEO of Cascade Industries. I want this flight smooth. No bumps, no turbulence, and absolutely no riffraff in the forward cabin. I'm up for my seniority review next month, Kyle. Everything needs to be perfect." "Yes, sir. Boarding is almost complete. We're just waiting on one late arrival for seat 1A. Daniel frowned. Seat 1A was prime real estate. It was usually reserved for high-tier frequent flyers, corporate executives, or well-connected politicians. "Who is it?" Kyle glanced at the tablet in his lap. "Name's Vincent Carter. No title listed. Last-minute full-fare purchase. Paid in cash at the counter, apparently." Daniel scoffed. "Cash at the counter? What is this? 1,985? Probably some lottery winner or a rapper's assistant. Keep an eye on it." Daniel left the cockpit to do his final walkthrough of the cabin. It was his ritual before every flight, a chance to survey his domain, to make sure the first-class section looked pristine and professional. He walked past the rows of lie-flat seats, nodding politely to Senator Hargrove, who was already sipping champagne from a crystal flute. "Smooth sailing today, Senator," Daniel said with a practiced smile. "Good to hear, Captain Morrison," the senator replied, barely looking up from his tablet. Daniel felt good. He was in control. Everything was in order. Then he saw him. The late arrival for seat 1A walked down the jet bridge, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look like a senator. He didn't look like a CEO. He was a tall black man with broad shoulders, wearing a charcoal gray hoodie with the hood pulled up slightly over his head. He wore loose-fitting joggers and heavy noise-canceling headphones around his neck. In one hand, he carried a battered leather duffel bag that looked like it had been through a war. He moved with quiet, unhurried confidence. His eyes scanned the cabin briefly, taking everything in. He stopped at seat 1A, tossed his duffel into the overhead bin with practiced ease, and sat down. Daniel stiffened. The sight offended every sensibility he had. This was first class. This was where the elite sat, where powerful people paid $10,000 to escape the chaos of economy. This man looked like he'd just walked off a basketball court or out of a subway station. It was visually jarring against the champagne flutes, tailored suits, and polished leather briefcases surrounding him. Daniel signaled to the lead flight attendant, Monica, a veteran of the skies who knew Daniel's temper all too well. She hurried over to the galley, where Daniel was already fuming. "Monica," Daniel hissed, his voice low but laced with venom. "Who is that in 1A? Monica glanced at the manifest. "That's Mr. Carter, Captain. He's the late arrival." "He looks lost," Daniel muttered, peering around the curtain. "Look at him. Hoodie. Joggers. He's making the other passengers uncomfortable." Monica glanced back toward the cabin. Senator Hargrove was reading a newspaper, completely ignoring Mr. Carter. The CEO of Cascade Industries was typing on his laptop, unbothered. "The senator seems fine, Captain. Mr. Carter has a valid ticket. He was polite when he boarded." "It's about standards, Monica," Daniel snapped, his face reddening. "We sell an image. People pay premium prices for these seats to be away from the chaos. That man, he doesn't fit the profile. He looks suspicious." "Suspicious?" Monica raised an eyebrow. "Captain, he's just sitting there." "He paid cash," Daniel said, his mind racing, connecting dots that didn't exist. "Last minute. That screams fraud or worse. I don't like it. He's degrading the VIP experience. I want you to go ask him for his boarding pass again. Check his ID. Make sure he actually belongs here." Monica sighed. She knew fighting Daniel was useless, but this felt wrong. "Captain, the gate agent's already checked." "Do it, Monica, or I will." Monica smoothed her skirt and walked into the aisle. She approached seat 1A. The man, Vincent Carter, was looking out the window, watching the rain. He turned as she approached. His eyes were calm, deep, and intelligent. "Mr. Carter?" Monica asked gently. "Yes." His voice was a deep baritone, polite but brief. "I'm so sorry to bother you, sir. Could I just see your boarding pass one more time? There was a glitch in our system." Vincent held her gaze for a second too long, as if he knew exactly what the glitch was. He didn't argue. He pulled a crisp boarding pass from his jacket pocket and handed it to her without a word. Monica scanned it. Everything was in order. Seat 1A. Full fare. Paid in cash. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I apologize for the inconvenience." "No problem," Vincent said quietly. He turned back to the window. Monica walked back to the galley, where Daniel was waiting like a vulture. "Everything's fine, Captain. His boarding pass is legitimate. He's in the right seat." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Fine. But I'm watching him. If he so much as looks at someone the wrong way, I want to know about it." Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. The cabin doors closed. The engine spooled up. Flight 827 pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi toward the runway. Daniel settled into the cockpit, running through his pre-flight checklist with Kyle. Everything was routine. Everything was under control. Until it wasn't. About 20 minutes into the flight, as the plane climbed through 28,000 feet, Monica's voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain Morrison, could you come to the cabin, please?" Daniel frowned. "What is it?" "Just, could you come back here, sir?" Daniel unbuckled and walked into the first-class cabin. Monica was standing near seat 1A, looking uncomfortable. Vincent Carter was still sitting calmly, his hands folded in his lap. But now, Senator Hargrove was standing in the aisle, his face red with indignation. "Captain Morrison," the senator said sharply, "I need to speak with you. Now." Daniel's chest swelled. Finally. Validation. "What seems to be the problem, Senator?" Senator Hargrove gestured toward Vincent. "This man has been sitting here the entire flight, minding his own business. And your flight attendant has harassed him twice now. I watched her check his boarding pass, his ID, and now she's asking him if he needs anything for the third time in 10 minutes. It's humiliating. And frankly, Captain, it's unacceptable." Daniel blinked. That wasn't what he expected to hear. "Senator, I can assure you." "Assure me of what?" Senator Hargrove interrupted. "That you're profiling passengers based on how they dress? I've been flying for 30 years, Captain. I know what I'm seeing. This man paid for his seat just like everyone else. Leave him alone." Daniel's face flushed. He looked at Vincent, who hadn't said a word. Vincent's expression was calm, almost neutral, but there was something in his eyes, something Daniel couldn't quite read. "Senator, I'm simply ensuring the safety and comfort of all passengers." "By harassing a black man in a hoodie?" Senator Hargrove's voice was cold now. "Do better, Captain." The senator sat back down, ending the conversation. Daniel stood there, frozen. The passengers around him were watching. Some had their phones out. He turned to Monica. "Get back to work," he muttered. Then he made the worst decision of his life. He looked at Vincent Carter. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." Vincent Carter didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply looked up at Daniel Morrison with those calm, steady eyes and said, "Excuse me?" "I need you to come to the back of the aircraft with me," Daniel repeated, his voice tight. "There's been a concern raised about your presence in this cabin." The entire first-class section went silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade into the background. Every passenger was watching now. Monica stood frozen near the galley, her face pale. Senator Hargrove stood up again. "Captain Morrison, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "Senator, please sit down. This is a safety matter." "Safety?" The senator's voice was rising now. "This man hasn't done anything. He's been sitting quietly for the entire flight. You're the one creating a disturbance." Daniel ignored him. He kept his eyes on Vincent. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Please, come with me." Vincent let out a slow breath. He looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers, the phones recording, the flight attendants watching with wide eyes. Then he looked back at Daniel. "Captain," Vincent said quietly, his voice steady, "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this. One chance to go back to your cockpit and fly this plane. Because what you're about to do is going to change your life in ways you can't imagine." Daniel's jaw clenched. He heard it as a threat. "Are you threatening me, sir?" "No," Vincent said calmly. "I'm warning you." Daniel felt his authority slipping. He felt the eyes of the passengers on him. He felt the weight of his uniform, his title, his legacy. And in that moment, his pride made the decision for him. "That's it. You're coming with me. Now." Vincent sighed. He stood up slowly, unfolding his tall frame. He was at least 6'3", broad-shouldered, calm. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his hoodie. "Don't reach for anything," Daniel barked, stepping back instinctively. Vincent paused. "Captain, I'm reaching for my identification. You asked for it. I'm giving it to you." Daniel's heart was pounding now. He felt the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Do it slowly." Vincent pulled out a black leather wallet. He opened it and held it up. Inside was a badge, a federal badge, and beneath it, an ID card with the seal of the United States Federal Aviation Administration. Administrator Vincent Carter. Daniel's blood turned to ice. The entire cabin seemed to tilt. The air left his lungs. His hands went numb. "No," Daniel whispered. Vincent's expression didn't change. He closed the wallet and put it back in his pocket. "Yes." Senator Hargrove let out a low whistle. "Oh, Captain, you just made a very big mistake." Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Vincent repeated, his voice calm, but edged with something cold. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't ask because you didn't care. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong here based on how I was dressed, based on the color of my skin. No, sir, that's not—" "Stop," Vincent said, raising a hand. "Don't insult both of us by lying. I've been doing this job for a long time, Captain Morrison. I've flown in cockpits. I've inspected aircraft. I've sat in meetings with presidents and CEOs. And I've also been profiled in airports, questioned by security, and treated like a criminal for wearing a hoodie. So don't stand there and tell me this wasn't about race. Because we both know it was." Daniel felt like the floor was falling out from under him. "Sir, I apologize. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" Vincent's voice was sharper now. "You didn't mean to humiliate me in front of an entire cabin? You didn't mean to violate FAA regulations on passenger rights? You didn't mean to abuse your authority as a pilot in command?" Daniel couldn't speak. His throat was tight. His hands were shaking. Vincent looked around the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. I'm going to return to my seat now. Captain Morrison is going to return to the cockpit. And when we land, there will be a full investigation into this incident." He sat back down in seat 1A, calm as ever. Daniel stood there, frozen, his entire world collapsing around him. Monica touched his arm gently. "Captain," she whispered, "you need to go back to the cockpit." Daniel turned and walked back to the flight deck, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He sat down in his seat, his hands trembling. Kyle looked at him, confused. "Captain, what happened back there?" Daniel couldn't answer. He just stared out the windshield at the endless sky, knowing that everything he had worked for, his career, his reputation, his legacy, was about to come crashing down. The rest of the flight was a blur. Daniel went through the motions, mechanically monitoring instruments, communicating with air traffic control, preparing for descent. But his mind was elsewhere. It was replaying the moment over and over again. The look in Vincent Carter's eyes, the badge, the federal seal. The Boeing 777 touched down at Los Angeles International Airport at 6:47 p.m. local time. The landing was smooth, textbook, but Daniel felt no satisfaction. He felt nothing but dread. As the plane taxied to the gate, Kyle turned to him. "Captain, there's a message from ground operations. They're requesting you remain on the aircraft after deplaning. FAA officials want to speak with you." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Understood." The passengers began to disembark. Daniel stayed in the cockpit, watching through the small window as they filed out. He saw Senator Hargrove shake Vincent Carter's hand. He saw Vincent gather his duffel bag and walk calmly off the plane, his posture relaxed, unbothered. Then the FAA officials arrived. There were 3 of them, 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing dark suits and federal badges. They entered the cockpit without knocking. "Captain Daniel Morrison?" the lead investigator asked. "Yes. I'm Agent Rebecca Lawson, with the FAA Office of Security and Hazardous Materials. We're here to conduct a preliminary investigation into an incident that occurred during Flight 827. You're required to submit your pilot's license and comply with an immediate suspension pending a full review." Daniel's hands shook as he reached for his wallet. He pulled out his pilot's license, the piece of plastic that had defined his entire adult life, and handed it over. Agent Lawson took it without ceremony. "You're grounded, Captain. Effective immediately." The days that followed were a nightmare. The video of the confrontation went viral within hours. Passengers had recorded every moment from Daniel demanding Vincent leave his seat, to the reveal of the federal badge, to the stunned silence that followed. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. Aviation forums dissected every second of the footage. Daniel became a symbol, not of authority, not of professionalism, but of arrogance, prejudice, and abuse of power. The airline Skyward International moved quickly to distance itself from him. They issued a public statement condemning his actions and announcing a full internal investigation. They suspended him without pay. His union refused to defend him, citing clear violations of company policy and federal regulations. His phone rang constantly. Reporters, lawyers, former colleagues calling to express their disappointment or, worse, their silence. Daniel's wife, Patricia, tried to be supportive, but even she couldn't hide her shock. "Danny, what were you thinking?" she asked one night, her voice breaking. "He was just sitting there. He wasn't doing anything wrong." I thought I was protecting the passengers," Daniel said weakly. "From what? A man in a hoodie?" He had no answer. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. 3 weeks later, Daniel received a formal letter from the Federal Aviation Administration. It was delivered by certified mail. His hands shook as he opened it. Notice of license revocation. Captain Daniel Morrison. After a thorough investigation into the events of Flight 827 on November 14th, the Federal Aviation Administration has determined that your actions constituted gross negligence, abuse of authority, and violation of federal aviation regulations regarding passenger rights and non-discrimination. Your pilot's license is hereby permanently revoked. You are prohibited from operating any aircraft within U.S. airspace. This decision is final and non-appealable. Signed, Vincent Carter, Administrator, Federal Aviation Administration. Daniel stared at the letter for a long time. The signature at the bottom felt like a branding iron. He had lost everything. His career, his reputation, his identity. All because he couldn't see past a hoodie. Vincent Carter sat in his office at FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., staring out the window at the Potomac River. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, but Vincent barely noticed. He was thinking about Daniel Morrison. He was thinking about the look on the captain's face when the badge came out. He was thinking about the dozens of other moments like it, moments when people had looked at him and decided he didn't belong. Vincent had grown up in South Chicago, the son of a postal worker and a school teacher. He'd fallen in love with aviation as a kid, watching planes take off from O'Hare Airport on summer afternoons. He joined the Air Force at 18, became a pilot, flew missions in the Middle East. He'd earned his commercial license, flown for Delta for 15 years, worked his way up through the ranks of the FAA. And through it all, he'd been profiled, questioned, doubted. Not because he wasn't qualified, but because he didn't look like what people expected a pilot or an administrator to look like. There was a knock on the door. Vincent's assistant, a sharp young woman named Angela, stepped inside. "Mr. Carter, the press briefing is in 10 minutes. Vincent nodded. "I'll be ready." "Sir, if I may, the Morrison case has gotten a lot of attention. Some people are saying you were too harsh, that revoking his license permanently was an overreaction." Vincent turned to face her. "Do you think it was an overreaction, Angela?" She hesitated. I think he made a terrible mistake. But people are saying he deserves a second chance." Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me tell you something. Daniel Morrison had 2 decades of experience. He'd flown thousands of flights. He'd been trained in FAA regulations, passenger rights, and anti-discrimination policies. And despite all of that, he looked at a man in a hoodie and decided that man was a threat. Not because of any behavior, not because of any evidence, but because of assumptions, prejudice, bias." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "If I give him a second chance, Angela, what message does that send? That it's okay to discriminate as long as you apologize afterward? That profiling is just a mistake, not a character flaw? No, Daniel Morrison made a choice. And choices have consequences. Angela nodded slowly. Understood, sir. Vincent grabbed his jacket and headed to the briefing room. The press room at FAA headquarters was packed. Reporters from every major news outlet were there. Cameras rolling, microphones ready. Vincent stepped up to the podium, his expression calm and composed. Good evening, he said. I'm here to address the incident involving Flight 827 and the actions taken against Captain Daniel Morrison. The room buzzed with anticipation. First, I want to be clear about what happened. Captain Morrison, without cause or justification, singled out a passenger based on appearance and demanded that passenger leave their seat. This was not a safety issue. This was not a security concern. This was profiling, plain and simple, and it violated federal regulations designed to protect passengers from discrimination. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Carter, some critics are saying that your personal involvement in this case, being the passenger who was profiled, creates a conflict of interest. How do you respond to that? Vincent met her gaze. I respond by saying that being the victim of discrimination doesn't disqualify me from holding people accountable for it. If anything, it gives me a unique perspective. I know what it feels like to be judged based on how I look, and I will not allow that to happen to anyone else under my watch. Another reporter spoke up. Do you think Captain Morrison is a racist? Vincent paused. I don't know what's in Daniel Morrison's heart, but I know what his actions were. And those actions had consequences. Whether he's a racist or simply someone who allowed bias to cloud his judgment, the result is the same. He abused his authority. He violated the trust placed in him as a pilot. And he humiliated a passenger in front of dozens of people. What message do you hope this sends to the aviation industry? Vincent leaned forward slightly. The message is simple. If you wear a uniform, if you command an aircraft, if you hold the lives of passengers in your hands, you are held to a higher standard. You don't get to bring your prejudices into the cockpit. You don't get to treat people differently because of how they look. And if you do, you will be held accountable, fully and completely. The room erupted in questions, but Vincent stepped away from the podium. He had said what needed to be said. Back in Denver, Daniel Morrison sat in his living room, watching the press briefing on television. His wife had gone to stay with her sister. His phone had stopped ringing. The house felt empty. He watched Vincent Carter speak with calm authority, answering questions, defending his decision. And Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Shame. Not just for losing his job, not just for the public humiliation, but for what he had done. He thought about the moment he first saw Vincent on the plane, the snap judgment he'd made, the assumptions, the certainty that this man didn't belong. And he realized, sitting there in the dim light of his living room, that Vincent had been right. It had been about race. Daniel had never thought of himself as racist. He had black colleagues. He'd flown with black first officers. He'd served black passengers without issue. But when it came down to it, when he saw a black man in a hoodie sitting in first class, his first instinct had been suspicion, discomfort, judgment, and that realization cut deeper than any FAA letter ever could. Months passed. The story of Flight 827 faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new controversies, but its impact lingered. Vincent Carter used the incident as a catalyst for change. He proposed a sweeping new initiative within the FAA mandatory bias training for all commercial pilots. It became known as the Morrison Protocol, a deliberate choice to ensure that Daniel's name would be associated not with his career, but with the lesson his failure taught. The Morrison Protocol required every pilot in the United States to undergo recertification training focused on recognizing and combating implicit bias. It covered case studies, scenario-based exercises, and real-world examples of how prejudice could compromise safety and passenger rights. Airlines pushed back at first. They argued it was unnecessary, expensive, time-consuming. But Vincent stood firm. If we can require pilots to train on emergency evacuations, on engine failures, on hijacking scenarios, we can require them to train on treating people with dignity. This isn't optional. This is fundamental. Within a year, the Morrison Protocol became federal law. Meanwhile, Daniel Morrison's life had taken a very different turn. Without his pilot's license, without his career, he found himself adrift. He tried to find work in aviation, ground operations, flight instruction, anything. But his name was poison. No one would hire him. He took a job driving a shuttle bus for a budget hotel near Denver International Airport. It was humiliating work. He wore a cheap polyester uniform with a name tag that said, Dan. He loaded luggage for tourists who didn't know his name, didn't care about his past, didn't recognize the man who used to command a $350 million aircraft. Every day, he drove past the airport. He watched planes take off and land. He saw pilots walking through the terminal in their crisp uniforms, rolling their flight bags behind them. And every day, the weight of what he had lost pressed down on him a little harder. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in the story, and share your thoughts in the comments. One cold afternoon in February, Daniel was loading luggage outside Terminal 3 when he saw someone he recognized. It was Kyle, his former first officer. Kyle had been promoted. He was wearing captain's stripes now, walking confidently with his crew toward the terminal entrance. He looked good, successful, happy. Kyle paused when he saw the shuttle bus driver. Their eyes met across the crowded sidewalk. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Kyle's expression shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something worse. Pity. Kyle gave a small, sad nod, an acknowledgement of what Daniel had become, and then turned and walked into the terminal, the automatic doors sliding open to welcome him into a world Daniel would never enter again. Daniel stood there in the cold, his hands gripping the handle of a stranger's suitcase, and felt the full weight of his choices settle over him like a shroud. He had been a king. Now he was invisible. The winter in Denver was brutal that year. The cold seemed to seep into everything, the streets, the buildings, the bones of the people who lived there. Daniel Morrison felt it more than most. He spent his days standing outside the hotel shuttle, waiting for passengers, loading bags, driving the same route over and over again. Every trip past the airport was a reminder of what he'd lost. He'd see the planes lined up on the tarmac, their noses pointed toward distant cities. He'd watch them lift off into the sky, graceful and powerful, and he'd remember what it felt like to be the one in control. But that life was gone, and it was never coming back. One evening, after his shift ended, Daniel sat in his car in the employee parking lot, staring at his phone. He'd been thinking about something for weeks now, something he hadn't been able to shake. He opened his email and began to type. To Administrator Vincent Carter. Subject: An apology long overdue. Mr. Carter, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you'll care, but I need to say it anyway. I was wrong. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what I did. And I was wrong to think that my uniform, my experience, or my title gave me the right to judge you based on how you looked. I've spent the last 6 months trying to justify what I did, trying to convince myself that it was about safety, about standards, about protecting my passengers. But the truth is, it wasn't about any of that. It was about prejudice. It was about fear. It was about seeing someone who didn't fit my narrow idea of what belonged in first class and deciding they didn't belong at all. I humiliated you. I abused my authority. And I failed as a pilot, not because I couldn't fly a plane, but because I forgot the most important part of the job, treating every person on that aircraft with dignity and respect. I know this doesn't change anything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I wanted you to know that I understand now. I see what I couldn't see before, and I'm sorry. Sincerely, Daniel Morrison. He stared at the email for a long time. Then he hit send. He didn't expect a response. But 3 days later, one arrived. From Administrator Vincent Carter. Subject: an apology long overdue. Daniel, I read your email, and I appreciate your honesty. I'm not going to tell you that your apology erases what happened. It doesn't. The damage was done, and the consequences were appropriate. But I will say this acknowledgement is the first step toward growth, and it takes courage to admit when you're wrong. What you did on that flight wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever been profiled, judged, or treated as less than because of how they look. It was about a system that allows those judgments to go unchecked, unchallenged, and unpunished. The Morrison Protocol isn't about punishing you, Daniel. It's about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else. It's about holding people accountable and demanding better from those who hold positions of power. I don't know what your future holds, but I hope you use this experience to become a better person. Not a better pilot that ship has sailed, but a better human being. Good luck, Vincent Carter. Daniel read the email 3 times. Then he closed his laptop and sat in silence. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. But it was something. The story of Flight 827 continued to ripple outward. News outlets revisited it months later as the Morrison Protocol rolled out nationwide. Pilots across the country were required to undergo the new training, and reactions were mixed. Some embraced it. They saw it as a necessary step toward creating a more inclusive, respectful industry. Others resented it. They saw it as political correctness gone too far, as an overreaction to a single incident. But Vincent didn't waver. He traveled to airports across the country, meeting with pilots, attending training sessions, answering questions. He spoke at conferences, gave interviews, and made it clear that the FAA was serious about this initiative. This isn't about making pilots feel bad, Vincent said during one training session in Atlanta. It's about making them better. It's about recognizing that we all have biases, conscious or unconscious, and that those biases can affect our judgment. If we can train pilots to handle engine failures, we can train them to handle their own prejudices. One pilot, a veteran with 30 years of experience, raised his hand. Mr. Carter, with all due respect, don't you think this is a bit much? I've been flying for 3 decades, and I've never had an incident like Morrison's. Vincent nodded, and I'm glad to hear that. But let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a passenger and made an assumption about them based on how they were dressed, or where they were sitting, or the color of their skin? The room went quiet. That's what I thought, Vincent said. Bias doesn't always look like what Daniel Morrison did. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's just a fleeting thought, a moment of discomfort, a decision you don't even realize you're making. But those moments add up, and they have consequences. The pilot sat back down, thoughtful. Back in Denver, Daniel Morrison continued his work at the hotel shuttle. But something had shifted inside him. Vincent's email had planted a seed, and slowly, painfully, it began to grow. He started reading books about implicit bias, about systemic racism, about the history of discrimination in America. He watched documentaries, listened to podcasts, attended community meetings. He began to understand, in a way he never had before, the world that Vincent Carter and millions of other Black Americans navigated every day. It was humbling, and it was necessary. One evening, Daniel attended a community forum on racial justice at a local church. It was uncomfortable. He was one of the only white people in the room. He listened as people shared their stories of being pulled over for no reason, of being followed in stores, of being treated with suspicion and fear simply because of the color of their skin. And he thought about Vincent Carter, sitting calmly in seat 1A, being questioned, doubted, and ultimately humiliated. After the forum, a woman approached him. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair. "I saw you listening," she said. Are you a reporter? No, Daniel said. I'm just trying to learn. Learn what? He hesitated. Then he said, how to be better. She smiled. That's a good place to start. Meanwhile, Vincent Carter's work continued. The Morrison Protocol had become a cornerstone of FAA policy, but he knew there was more to be done. He pushed for diversity initiatives in pilot training programs, for scholarships for aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities, for stricter enforcement of anti-discrimination policies. He faced resistance at every turn, but he didn't back down. One afternoon, Vincent received an invitation to speak at the National Aviation Conference in Las Vegas. It was one of the biggest events in the industry, attended by thousands of pilots, executives, and aviation professionals. The keynote address was scheduled for the final day of the conference. Vincent stood backstage, listening to the hum of the crowd, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. When his name was called, he walked onto the stage to a standing ovation. He looked out at the sea of faces, pilots in uniform, executives in suits, young aviators just starting their careers. Thank you, Vincent said, his voice steady. I'm honored to be here, but I'm not here to be celebrated. I'm here to challenge you. The room fell silent. I'm here to tell you that the aviation industry has a problem. It's a problem we don't like to talk about. It's a problem we'd rather ignore. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away. The problem is bias. The problem is discrimination. The problem is the belief that some people belong in the cockpit and others don't. That some people belong in first class and others don't. That some people deserve respect and others don't. He paused, letting his words sink in. 6 months ago, I was profiled on a flight. I was judged, questioned, and humiliated, not because of anything I did, but because of how I looked. And the man who did it was a captain with 20 years of experience, a man who should have known better. Vincent clicked a button on the remote in his hand. Behind him, a photo of Daniel Morrison appeared on the screen, his official airline portrait, crisp and professional. This is Captain Daniel Morrison. He lost his career because of what he did. And some of you might think that's unfair, that it's too harsh, that everyone deserves a second chance. He paused again. But here's what I want you to understand. Daniel Morrison didn't just make a mistake. He made a choice. He chose to see a black man in a hoodie and assume the worst. He chose to prioritize his own biases over the dignity of a paying passenger, and he chose to abuse his authority to enforce those biases. The room was silent. So yes, he lost his career. And yes, it was harsh, but it was also necessary. Because if we don't hold people accountable, if we don't demand better from those who hold power, then nothing changes. The system stays the same. The bias continues. And the next Vincent Carter who boards a plane in a hoodie will face the same treatment. Vincent looked out at the crowd. I'm asking you to do better. I'm asking you to examine your own biases, to challenge your own assumptions, and to treat every person you encounter with the respect they deserve. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. The applause started slowly, then built into a roar. Vincent stepped off the stage, his heart pounding, knowing that he had done what he came to do. The months turned into a year. The Morrison Protocol became standard practice across the United States aviation industry. Every commercial pilot, from the newly licensed to the 30-year veterans, underwent the mandatory bias training. Some completed it begrudgingly. Others took it seriously, engaging with the material, confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. The aviation industry began to change, slowly but measurably. Reports of passenger profiling incidents dropped. Complaints filed with the FAA regarding discriminatory treatment decreased by 42% in the first year alone. Airlines began implementing their own internal diversity and inclusion programs, hiring more pilots and crew members from underrepresented backgrounds. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was progress. And Vincent Carter was at the center of it all. He continued his work at the FAA with a renewed sense of purpose. He pushed for stronger enforcement of anti-discrimination policies, for greater transparency in how complaints were handled, for accountability at every level of the industry. He became a symbol not just of resilience, but of justice. Daniel Morrison, meanwhile, had disappeared from public view. He no longer drove the shuttle bus. That job had been too painful, too much of a daily reminder of what he'd lost. Instead, he found work at a small nonprofit organization in Denver that focused on re-entry programs for formerly incarcerated individuals. It was humble work helping people fill out job applications, prepare for interviews, navigate the challenges of rebuilding their lives after making mistakes. It was also deeply humbling. Daniel saw himself in the faces of the people he worked with. People who had made bad choices, who had lost everything, who were trying to find a way forward in a world that didn't want to give them a second chance. He didn't tell anyone about his past. He didn't mention that he used to be a pilot, that he used to command million-dollar aircraft, that he used to be somebody. He was just Dan now, and maybe that was okay. One afternoon, a young man named Terrell came into the office. He was in his early 20s, black, with a cautious demeanor and tired eyes. He'd been released from prison 3 weeks earlier after serving time for a drug offense. He needed a job. He needed help. Daniel sat down with him, going through the basics, resume building, interview tips, how to address the gap in his employment history. Terrell listened quietly, taking notes. Then he looked up and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you doing this?" Daniel paused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you don't have to be here. You could be doing anything else. Why do you care about people like me?" Daniel thought about the question. He thought about Vincent Carter. He thought about Flight 827. He thought about the moment he'd pointed at a man in a hoodie and decided he didn't belong. "Because I made a mistake once," Daniel said quietly. "A big one. And it cost me everything. But I'm trying to learn from it. I'm trying to be better. And maybe, by helping people like you, I can do something good with what's left." Terrell nodded slowly. "That's real, man. I respect that." 2 years after the incident, Vincent Carter received an unexpected phone call. It was from a producer at a major news network. They were doing a special documentary on the Morrison Protocol and its impact on the aviation industry. They wanted Vincent to be the centerpiece of the story. "We'd like to interview you," the producer said. "And we'd also like to interview Captain Morrison, if he's willing." Vincent's first instinct was to say no. He didn't want to revisit the incident. He didn't want to give Daniel Morrison a platform. But then he thought about it. Maybe it was time. "I'll do it," Vincent said. "But I want editorial approval. I want to make sure this isn't sensationalized. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability and change." "Understood, Mr. Carter." A week later, Vincent sat in a studio in Washington, D.C. Cameras positioned around him, lights adjusted, microphones clipped to his collar. The interviewer, a well-known journalist named Rachel Martinez, sat across from him. "Mr. Carter, thank you for being here," Rachel began. "Let's start at the beginning. Can you walk us through what happened on Flight 827? Vincent took a breath. "I was traveling for work. I had a last-minute meeting in Los Angeles, so I booked a seat on the first available flight. I prefer to travel low-key. I don't like drawing attention to myself, so I wore comfortable clothes. A hoodie, joggers, nothing unusual." "And when you boarded the plane?" "I boarded like any other passenger. I found my seat 1A and sat down. I didn't think anything of it. But almost immediately, I could feel the tension. The captain, Daniel Morrison, was walking through the cabin. I could see him watching me, and I knew what was coming." Rachel leaned forward. "How did you know?" Vincent's expression was somber. "Because it's happened before. Not to this extent, but variations of it. I've been stopped by security at airports. I've been asked for extra identification. I've had flight attendants question my ticket. It's part of being a black man in America. You learn to recognize the signs. What went through your mind when Captain Morrison confronted you? Honestly, disappointment. I was disappointed that someone with his experience, his training, could look at me and see a threat instead of a passenger. I was disappointed that the color of my skin and the clothes I was wearing mattered more than the fact that I had paid for my seat, followed all the rules, and done nothing wrong. Rachel nodded. You revealed your identity as the FAA administrator. What was his reaction? Vincent allowed himself a small, humorless smile. Shock, horror, regret. All of it too late. Some people have criticized your decision to revoke his license permanently. They say it was too harsh. What do you say to that? Vincent's jaw tightened. I say that actions have consequences. Daniel Morrison didn't just embarrass himself. He violated federal regulations. He abused his authority. And he humiliated a passenger in front of an entire cabin. If I had let that slide, what message would that send? That it's okay to discriminate as long as you apologize afterward? No. The punishment fit the crime. Rachel paused, then said, We reached out to Captain Morrison for this documentary. He agreed to speak with us. Would you be willing to see him again? Vincent hesitated. Why? Because I think there's value in a conversation. Not for his sake, for everyone watching. For the pilots, the passengers, the people who need to understand why this matters. Vincent considered it. Then he nodded. All right, I'll do it. If you were in Vincent's position, knowing what Daniel did, would you agree to meet him face to face after all this time? Share your thoughts in the comments. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a conference room at a hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. No cameras would be present for the initial conversation. Just Vincent, Daniel, and a mediator to ensure things stayed civil. Daniel arrived first. He looked different, older, thinner. The confidence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something quieter, something humbler. Vincent arrived 10 minutes later. He walked into the room and saw Daniel sitting at the table, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes downcast. The two men sat across from each other in silence for a long moment. Finally, Daniel spoke. Mr. Carter, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to understand. But I want you to know that I've spent every day of the last 2 years thinking about what I did. And I'm sorry. I'm deeply, truly sorry. Vincent studied him. Do you understand what you did wrong, Daniel? I profiled you. I judged you. I let my biases dictate my actions. And why did you do it? Daniel's voice cracked. Because I was afraid. Not of you. Not of anything rational. I was afraid of losing control. I was afraid that if someone like you could sit in first class, then maybe the world I understood, the world where people like me were in charge, was changing. And that terrified me. Vincent leaned back in his chair. That's the most honest thing you've said. Daniel looked up, his eyes red. I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to be better. I'm working at a nonprofit now, helping people rebuild their lives. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to grow. Vincent nodded slowly. Good, because that's all you can do. You can't change the past, but you can choose what you do with the present. The two men sat in silence for another long moment. Then Vincent extended his hand across the table. Daniel stared at it, unsure. I'm not forgiving you, Vincent said, but I'm acknowledging your effort. That's all I can give you. Daniel took his hand and shook it, his grip firm but trembling. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a step. The documentary aired 6 months later. It was titled Grounded, The Flight That Changed Aviation. It featured interviews with Vincent, Daniel, Senator Hargrove, Monica, the flight attendant, Kyle, the first officer, and several aviation experts who analyzed the incident and its aftermath. The response was overwhelming. Millions of people watched. Social media exploded with reactions, some supportive, some critical, some deeply personal. Pilots shared their own experiences with bias. Passengers recounted moments when they'd been profiled. The conversation expanded beyond aviation. into broader discussions about race, power, and accountability. Vincent received thousands of messages, emails, letters, social media comments. Most were positive, thanking him for his courage, his leadership, his refusal to back down. But some were angry, accusing him of being too harsh, of destroying a man's life over a single mistake. He read them all, even the angry ones, because he knew this wasn't about him. It was about something bigger. One evening, Vincent sat in his office, watching the sun set over the Potomac. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Angela, his assistant. "Sir, you need to see this." She sent him a link to a video. It was a TikTok post from a young black woman named Jasmine, a college student studying aerospace engineering. In the video, Jasmine was sitting in an airport terminal, wearing a hoodie and headphones, looking relaxed and confident. 2 years ago, she said in the video, I watched the story of Vincent Carter and Flight 827. I saw a black man in a hoodie get profiled by a pilot, and I thought, that could have been me. But then I saw what happened next. I saw Vincent Carter hold that pilot accountable. I saw him create the Morrison Protocol. I saw him refuse to let bias go unchallenged. And I thought, if he can do that, then I can become a pilot too. She smiled at the camera. So here I am, about to board a flight for my first solo cross-country training. I'm wearing a hoodie, and I'm going to fly this plane like I belong in the cockpit, because I do. The video had over 2 million views. Vincent watched it 3 times, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was why it mattered. Meanwhile, Daniel Morrison's life had continued its quiet transformation. He'd become a fixture at the nonprofit, respected by his colleagues, trusted by the people he helped. He'd started volunteering at a local youth center, mentoring young men who reminded him of Terrell, young men who needed guidance, who needed someone to believe in them. One afternoon, Daniel was leading a workshop on resume writing when a teenager raised his hand. Mr. Dan, can I ask you something? Of course. You said you used to have a different career. What did you do? Daniel hesitated. He'd kept his past private for 2 years, careful not to draw attention to himself, not to make the story about him. But maybe it was time to be honest. I was a pilot, Daniel said quietly. The room went silent. Several of the kids exchanged glances. Like, a real pilot? Another kid asked. Flying planes and stuff? Yes. I flew commercial jets for over 20 years. So why are you here? The first teenager asked. Why aren't you flying anymore? Daniel took a breath. Because I made a terrible mistake. I let my biases, my prejudices, cloud my judgment. And I hurt someone because of it. I lost my career. I lost everything. And I deserve to. The kid stared at him. But I'm trying to do better now. Daniel continued. I'm trying to learn from what I did wrong. And I'm trying to help people like you avoid making the same mistakes I did. One of the teenagers, a young black kid named Marcus, raised his hand. Was it about race? Daniel met his eyes. Yes, it was. Marcus nodded slowly. At least you're being real about it. 3 years after the incident, the Federal Aviation Administration held a ceremony at its headquarters in Washington, D.C. It was a formal event, attended by government officials, airline executives, pilots, and members of the press. Vincent Carter stood at a podium on the stage, looking out at the audience. Behind him, projected on a massive screen, was the seal of the FAA and the words, the Morrison Protocol, 3 years of progress. Good afternoon, Vincent began. 3 years ago, I boarded a flight in Chicago. I was profiled by the captain of that aircraft. I was humiliated, questioned, and treated as if I didn't belong. And in the aftermath of that incident, we made a choice. We chose accountability over excuses. We chose change over comfort. And we chose to demand better from the people entrusted with the safety and dignity of passengers. He clicked a button on the remote. Statistics appeared on the screen. In the 3 years since the Morrison Protocol was implemented, reports of passenger profiling have decreased by 63%. Diversity in pilot training programs has increased by 41%. And passenger satisfaction regarding respectful treatment has reached an all-time high. The audience applauded. But this isn't just about numbers, Vincent continued. This is about people. This is about the young black woman studying to be a pilot who now believes she belongs in the cockpit. This is about the elderly Latino man who can board a plane without being questioned about his ticket 3 times. This is about the Muslim woman in a hijab who doesn't have to fear being singled out for random screening. He paused, his voice growing softer but no less powerful. This is about creating an industry where everyone is treated with dignity, where the color of your skin, the clothes you wear, or the religion you practice doesn't determine how you're treated, and where those who fail to uphold that standard are held accountable. The applause was thunderous. Vincent stepped away from the podium, but before he left the stage, he said one more thing. This protocol is named after Captain Daniel Morrison, not to shame him, not to punish him, but to remember that authority is not a license to judge. That power is not permission to discriminate, and that every choice we make, every decision, every action has consequences. In Denver, Daniel Morrison watched the ceremony on his laptop. He sat alone in his small apartment, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. He watched Vincent speak. He watched the statistics scroll by. He watched the audience applaud. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, not in himself, not in what he had done, but in what Vincent had built from the wreckage of his mistake. The Morrison Protocol wasn't a monument to his failure. It was a testament to Vincent's determination to create something better. Daniel closed his laptop and sat in the quiet. He would never fly again. He would never command a cockpit, never feel the rush of takeoff, never watch the sun rise from 30,000 feet. But maybe, just maybe, he could live the rest of his life in a way that honored the lesson he'd learned. Maybe that would be enough. Years continued to pass. The Morrison Protocol became so ingrained in the aviation industry that new pilots didn't remember a time when it didn't exist. It was simply part of the training, part of the culture, part of what it meant to be a professional pilot. Vincent Carter eventually stepped down as FAA administrator, but his legacy endured. He was invited to speak at universities, at conferences, at corporate events. He wrote a book about leadership, accountability, and the importance of confronting bias. And through it all, he never forgot the moment that changed everything. The moment he boarded Flight 827 wearing a hoodie and headphones, just trying to get to a meeting. Because that moment wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, profiled unjustly, or treated as if they didn't belong. And Vincent had made sure that moment meant something. On a cold December evening, 5 years after the incident, Vincent received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the envelope plain and unadorned. He opened it. Dear Mr. Carter, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Daniel Morrison. 5 years ago, I was the captain on Flight 827. I profiled you, I humiliated you, and I lost my career because of it. I'm writing to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. Thank you. Thank you for holding me accountable. Thank you for not letting me off the hook. Thank you for using what happened to create something meaningful. I've spent the last 5 years trying to be a better person. I've worked with people who've made mistakes, who've lost everything, who are trying to rebuild. And through that work, I've come to understand what you understood all along, that accountability isn't punishment, it's growth. I'll never fly again. I've made peace with that, but I'm trying to live a life that matters. I'm trying to be someone who lifts others up instead of tearing them down. I hope you're well. I hope you know the difference you've made. Sincerely, Daniel Morrison. Vincent read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, but he kept the letter. because it reminded him that change is possible, that growth is possible, that even the worst moments can lead to something better. 10 years after Flight 827, the aviation industry looked vastly different. The Morrison Protocol had evolved beyond mandatory training into a comprehensive framework that shaped hiring practices, passenger rights enforcement, and internal accountability structures at airlines across the United States. New generations of pilots entered the profession with a fundamentally different mindset. They understood that commanding an aircraft wasn't just about technical skill, it was about leadership, empathy, and the ability to see every passenger as a human being deserving of respect. The incident itself had become a case study in business schools, law schools, and aviation academies. Students analyzed it from every angle: the psychological factors that led to bias, the legal ramifications of discrimination, the organizational response required to prevent similar incidents. Vincent Carter's name became synonymous with principled leadership, but he never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who had been in the right place at the right time, or perhaps the wrong place at the wrong time, and had chosen to use that moment to create change. He continued his work, now as a consultant and speaker, traveling the country to share his story and challenge organizations to examine their own biases and systems of accountability. One spring afternoon, Vincent received an invitation to speak at the graduation ceremony for a new class of pilots at the Midwest Aviation Academy in Kansas City. It was a small school, but it had an impressive track record of training diverse pilots and fostering an inclusive culture. Vincent accepted. The ceremony was held in a hangar at the Academy's airfield. Rows of chairs were set up in front of a temporary stage. Behind the stage, several small training aircraft were parked, their propellers gleaming in the afternoon sun. The graduating class was diverse men and women of different races, ages, and backgrounds, all wearing matching navy blue flight suits with gold wings pinned to their chests. Vincent took the stage to a standing ovation. He looked out at the young faces staring back at him, eager and hopeful. "Congratulations," Vincent began. "You've worked hard to get here. You've spent countless hours in the classroom, in the simulator, in the cockpit. You've learned to fly. And that's an incredible accomplishment." He paused, letting the applause settle. "But flying a plane is the easy part," he continued. "What's hard is the responsibility that comes with it. The responsibility to treat every person on your manifest with dignity. The responsibility to check your biases at the door. The responsibility to remember that your authority as a pilot is not a license to judge others, it's a duty to serve them." The students listened intently. 10 years ago, I was profiled on a flight by a captain who looked at me and decided I didn't belong. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give me the benefit of the doubt. He just made assumptions based on how I looked, and those assumptions cost him everything. Vincent's voice grew quieter but more intense. "I'm not telling you this story to scare you. I'm telling you this story to remind you that the choices you make matter. Every decision you make in that cockpit, every word you speak, every action you take has consequences. Not just for you, but for the people whose lives you touch." He looked across the faces in front of him. One young woman in the front row had tears in her eyes. A young black man, near the back, sat up straighter, his expression determined. "So, as you leave here today, as you begin your careers, I want you to remember one thing. You are not just pilots. You are leaders. And leaders are judged not by how well they command, but by how well they serve." The applause was deafening. After the ceremony, several students approached Vincent to thank him, to shake his hand, to tell him their stories. One young woman, a Latina pilot named Sophia, said, "Mr. Carter, I grew up hearing about Flight 827, and every time I doubted whether I belonged in aviation, I thought about what you did. You didn't just hold that captain accountable. You showed people like me that we have a place in the sky." Vincent smiled. "You've always had a place in the sky, Sophia. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Meanwhile, in a small town outside Denver, Daniel Morrison was preparing for a different kind of ceremony. He stood in front of a mirror in his bedroom, adjusting the collar of a simple gray suit. It was nothing fancy he'd bought it second-hand from a thrift store, but it was clean, pressed, and respectful. Today, he was attending the high school graduation of Marcus, the young man he'd been mentoring for the past 4 years. Marcus had been through a lot. He'd grown up in a tough neighborhood, lost his father to violence, struggled with anger and identity. But with Daniel's guidance and the support of the nonprofit where Daniel worked, Marcus had turned his life around. He'd graduated with honors. He'd been accepted to college. He had a future. And Daniel had been invited to attend the ceremony as Marcus's guest of honor. It was one of the proudest moments of Daniel's life. The graduation was held at a local high school auditorium. Daniel sat in the audience, surrounded by families celebrating their children's achievements. When Marcus's name was called, Daniel stood and applauded louder than anyone. Marcus walked across the stage, accepted his diploma, and turned to the audience. He found Daniel in the crowd and gave a small nod, a gesture of gratitude, of respect. After the ceremony, Marcus found Daniel outside the auditorium. He was grinning from ear to ear. "We did it, Mr. Dan," Marcus said, shaking Daniel's hand. "You did it," Daniel corrected. "I just showed up. You put in the work." Marcus shook his head. "Nah, man. You believed in me when nobody else did. You didn't give up on me. That meant everything." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "You deserve someone to believe in you, Marcus. You always did." Marcus paused, then said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? What you did? The mistake that cost you everything?" Daniel thought about the question. He thought about the cockpit, the uniform, the life he used to have. And then he thought about Marcus, about Terrell, about all the people he'd helped over the past decade. "I regret the pain I caused," Daniel said. "I regret the hurt I put Mr. Carter through. But do I regret where it led me? No, because if I hadn't lost everything, I never would have found this. I never would have found a way to actually make a difference." Marcus smiled. "That's deep, Mr. Dan." Daniel laughed. "Get out of here, kid. Go celebrate." Looking at Marcus and Daniel's relationship, how do you think second chances should work in our society? Should someone who makes a huge mistake ever get the opportunity to rebuild? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. 15 years after Flight 827, the Morrison Protocol had become so embedded in the aviation industry that it had been adopted internationally. Countries around the world implemented similar training programs, recognizing that bias and discrimination were not uniquely American problems. Vincent Carter was invited to speak at the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal, addressing aviation leaders from over 100 countries. He stood at the podium, looking out at the assembly of delegates. 15 years ago, Vincent began, I boarded a plane wearing a hoodie. I was profiled, humiliated, and treated as if I didn't belong. But what happened next wasn't just about me. It was about a choice to hold power accountable, a choice to demand better, a choice to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change. He paused, looking across the room. The Morrison Protocol is named after the man who wronged me, but it represents something bigger than him and bigger than me. It represents the idea that we can learn from our failures, that we can grow from our mistakes, and that we can create systems that protect the dignity of every person, no matter who they are or where they come from. The delegates applauded. I'm standing here today not as a victim, but as someone who refused to let injustice have the last word. And I'm asking you to do the same. Take this framework, adapt it to your countries, your cultures, your airlines, and make sure that no one is ever made to feel like they don't belong simply because of how they look. The applause was overwhelming. 20 years after the incident, Vincent Carter retired from public life. He moved to a quiet town in Vermont, bought a small house near a lake, and spent his days reading, hiking, and enjoying the peace he'd earned. He didn't give speeches anymore. He didn't attend conferences. He'd said what needed to be said, but people still remembered. Young pilots still cited him as an inspiration. Airlines still trained their crews using the Morrison Protocol. And every year, on the anniversary of Flight 827, social media filled with posts thanking Vincent for his courage, his leadership, his refusal to back down. One evening, Vincent sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the lake. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophia, the young Latina pilot he'd met at the graduation ceremony years ago. "Mr. Carter, I just completed my first transatlantic flight as captain. Thought you'd want to know. Thank you for everything." Vincent smiled and typed back, "Congratulations, Captain Sophia. The sky is yours." He set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of 2 decades of struggle, growth, and change settle over him like a warm blanket. He'd never wanted to be a symbol. He'd never wanted to be a hero. But he'd done what needed to be done, and that was enough. 25 years after Flight 827, the world had moved on. New crises, new controversies, new stories filled the headlines. But for those who had lived through it, the memory remained vivid. Daniel Morrison was 72 years old. He still lived in Denver, still worked part-time at the nonprofit, still mentored young people who needed guidance. His hair had gone completely white. His hands shook slightly when he wrote. But his eyes were clear, and his purpose was unwavering. He'd never remarried after Patricia left him. He'd never sought the spotlight, never tried to rehabilitate his public image. He'd simply lived his life quietly, helping others, trying to make amends for a mistake he could never undo. One winter morning, Daniel received a call from Marcus, the young man he'd mentored 15 years earlier. Marcus was now a successful social worker, running his own nonprofit in Atlanta. "Mr. Dan," Marcus said, his voice warm, "I wanted to let you know I'm naming our new youth center after you." Daniel was stunned. "Marcus, you don't have to." "I want to," Marcus interrupted. "You changed my life. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And I want other kids to know that people can change. That mistakes don't define you. What you do after defines you." Daniel felt tears welling up. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more than you know." After the call ended, Daniel sat in silence, overwhelmed by the grace of it all. He'd lost everything 25 years ago. But in the ruins of his career, he'd found something more valuable, a purpose, a calling, a way to matter. He'd never fly again. But he'd helped dozens of young people soar. Vincent Carter, now 78, lived peacefully in Vermont. His days were simple morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks through the woods, evenings reading by the fireplace. He'd written 3 books, each exploring different aspects of leadership, accountability, and justice. All had become bestsellers. He'd been approached countless times over the years to run for political office, to lead major organizations, to take on high-profile roles. He'd declined every offer. "I've done my work," he'd told his closest friends. "Now it's time for the next generation to carry it forward." One afternoon, Vincent received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a young black woman in a pilot's uniform, standing in front of a Boeing 787. She was smiling, confident, proud. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Because of you, I knew I belonged. Thank you, Captain Carter." Vincent stared at the photo for a long time, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This was why it had all been worth it. The legacy of Flight 827 lived on in ways both tangible and intangible. The Morrison Protocol continued to evolve, adapting to new challenges, new forms of bias, new opportunities for growth. Airlines competed to demonstrate their commitment to diversity and inclusion, knowing that passengers were watching, judging, choosing where to spend their money based on values as much as prices. The aviation industry had become more reflective, more accountable, more just. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. And that was the point. On the 25th anniversary of the incident, a major news network produced a retrospective documentary. They tracked down the key players: Senator Hargrove, now retired; Monica, the flight attendant, now a flight operations manager; Kyle, now a senior captain; and several passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. They also reached out to Vincent and Daniel. Vincent declined to participate. "I've said everything I need to say," he told the producers. "Let the work speak for itself." Daniel also declined, but for a different reason. "This isn't my story to tell anymore," he said. "It belongs to the people who've used it to create change. I'm just grateful I could be part of that, even if I was the cautionary tale." The documentary aired without them, but their presence was felt throughout in the archival footage, in the testimony of others, in the lasting impact of the Morrison Protocol. One segment featured an interview with a now famous pilot named Jasmine Mitchell, the college student who had posted the TikTok video years earlier. She was now a captain for a major international airline, one of the youngest black female captains in the industry. "Flight 827 changed my life," Jasmine said in the interview. "Not because of what Captain Morrison did, but because of what Administrator Carter did afterward. He showed me that accountability matters, that justice matters, and that people like me belong in the cockpit, no matter what anyone else thinks." In the final months of his life, Vincent Carter reflected on the journey. He sat on his porch one evening, watching the stars emerge in the Vermont sky, and thought about the man he'd been 25 years ago. He'd boarded a plane in a hoodie, just trying to get to a meeting. He'd been profiled, humiliated, treated as less than, but he'd refused to let that be the end of the story. He'd demanded accountability. He'd created change. He'd built a legacy that would outlast him. And in doing so, he'd proven something essential, that one person, standing firm in the face of injustice, could make a difference. Vincent passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold December night, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the Vermont wilderness he'd come to love. News of his death spread quickly. Tributes poured in from around the world, from pilots, passengers, activists, leaders. The President of the United States issued a statement praising Vincent's courage and leadership. Airlines lowered their flags to half-staff. But the most meaningful tribute came from the thousands of pilots who took to social media to share photos of themselves in their uniforms, holding signs that read, "Because of Vincent Carter, I fly with dignity." The Morrison Protocol was officially renamed the Carter-Morrison Protocol, acknowledging both the man who had been wronged and the lesson learned from the man who had wronged him. Daniel Morrison attended Vincent's memorial service. He sat in the back, unnoticed by most, watching as speaker after speaker praised Vincent's life and legacy. When the service ended, Daniel walked to the front of the church and stood before Vincent's photograph, a portrait of him in his FAA uniform, smiling slightly, his eyes calm and wise. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, "for holding me accountable, for making me better, for turning my worst moment into something meaningful." He placed a single white rose beneath the photograph and walked away. The story of Flight 827 became legend. It was taught in classrooms, discussed in boardrooms, referenced in courtrooms. It became a symbol of what happens when power is held accountable, when bias is confronted, when one person refuses to accept injustice. And at the heart of it all were two men, one who had made a terrible mistake, and one who had refused to let that mistake define the future. Vincent Carter had shown the world what principled leadership looked like. Daniel Morrison had shown the world what true accountability looked like. Together, they had created a story that would outlast them both. Years later, a young pilot, a woman of Middle Eastern descent, boarded a flight wearing a hijab. She found her seat in first class, settled in, and waited for takeoff. The captain walked through the cabin during his pre-flight check. He paused when he saw her, and for a moment, she tensed. But then he smiled. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome aboard. Is there anything I can get for you?" She relaxed, smiled back. "No, thank you, Captain. I'm all set." He nodded and continued down the aisle. The woman pulled out her phone and sent a text to her mother. "I'm on the plane. The captain treated me with respect. Things really have changed." She didn't know about Flight 827. She didn't know about Vincent Carter or Daniel Morrison, or the Morrison Protocol. She just knew that she was treated like she belonged, and that was the point. The story of Vincent Carter and Daniel Morrison reminds us that authority is fragile, built on trust, and maintained by integrity. Captain Morrison believed his uniform made him invincible, that his rank gave him the right to judge others based on appearances. But in the end, it was his own judgment that grounded him. Vincent didn't just win because he had a higher position. He won because he had something Morrison lacked: humility, dignity, and the courage to demand accountability. The Morrison Protocol serves as a lasting lesson in the aviation industry and beyond. The most dangerous turbulence isn't in the air, it's in the mind of a person who forgets their humanity. Captain Morrison wanted to clear his cabin of people he deemed unfit, but the universe has a way of balancing the scales. In trying to protect his VIP world, he proved he was the only one truly unfit to be part of it. This story hit differently, didn't it? The moment Daniel Morrison realized who Vincent Carter was, that frozen expression, that sudden understanding that his career was over, it's a reminder that our choices have consequences. I hope this story made you think about how we judge people, how we treat those who look different from us, and what real accountability looks like. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, only to prove them completely wrong? Or maybe you've caught yourself making assumptions about someone and had to check yourself. Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences matter. If this story moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to Justice Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. These stories need to be told, and your support helps me keep bringing them to you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone who's been profiled. Maybe it's someone in a position of authority who needs the reminder. Maybe it's just someone who believes in justice and accountability. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. And thank you for believing that stories like this matter. I'll see you in the next one. End of script. Total word count: 8,027 words.